Okay, everybody, we're going to get started this morning. So let's get started, everybody. All right, so welcome back to the last day of the UNSA Cinema Conference. I'm sure today will be just as stimulating as yesterday and the day before. I'd like to welcome up Jennifer Johung from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, who will be introducing this morning's plenary, James Leo Cahill.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here at 9 a.m. To hear James Leo Cahill. I have the great pleasure of introducing James this morning. James is that kind of scholar that I actually and truly admire, who can easily and deftly move between various frameworks and scales of exploration from, of course, film studies and the materiality of the filmic medium, to animal studies, to natural history and ecological materialism, to questions pertaining to the Anthropocene across both so-called old and new media, as well as across the natural sciences and the humanities. His work consistently challenges us to think of the living world and its multiple and possible futures as manifested and manifold within the filmic world of worldly representations. James Leo Cahill is Associate Professor of Cinema Studies in French at the University of Toronto, and author of Cinema's Copernican Vocation, Zoological Surrealism and the Early Films of Jean Painlevé, which is forthcoming from the University of Minnesota Press. His numerous articles appear in Discourse, Empedocles, Framework, Journal of Visual Culture, Kunstform International, Spectator, and he has published chapters in the anthologies Animal Life and the Moving Image, Screening Nature, Martin Arnold Gross Anatomies, and the New Silent Cinema, for which his YouTube bestiary was awarded the SCMS Best Essay in an edited collection in 2017. He is general editor of Discourse, Journal for Theoretical Studies in Media and Culture, and co-chair of the Toronto Film and Media Seminar. This academic year, he has been a residential fellow at the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, France, and visiting associate professor with the Franck Institute for the Humanities Mellon Foundation Center for Disciplinary Innovation at the University of Chicago, where he and Jennifer Wild are co-teaching the seminar Guillotine Barricade, Figures of History Across Media. He is currently working on a new monograph called A Hexagon-Shaped World, French Cinema and the Literature of Exploration from the Little Prince to the Planet of the Apes, as well as projects on a natural history of cinema and art history of the guillotine. So please join me in welcoming James Leo Cahill.
Well, I'm going to have to borrow that because I could never describe my own work in such ambitious or beautiful, elegant terms. So thank you so much for an introduction. I surely don't merit, but I'm pleased to claim and own. And really, thank you to Richard and Jocelyn for the honor of this invitation. Discourse, the journal I edit, spent a long time at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, so this has been one of my North Stars in terms of my thought, the places I think cool things happen, and obviously we all know from this weekend, this is where cool things happen. Hopefully I won't break that rhythm too badly this morning. I also want to thank the graduate students and the staff for their hard work and logistical support, making, as was said yesterday, our weekend really soft. I thought that was the perfect way to describe it. And I just want to thank all the other panelists and participants for what has been such a rich exchange of ideas. My mind has really been kept aflame this entire weekend. And so hopefully what I'm going to say this morning, which is some brand new work, there will be some experiments that may not stick the landing, but we'll give it a shot. I think it will have some resonances with some of the material that's been circulating amongst us as a community. And I will just make one apologia, which is to keep things at about 45 minutes. And because of the not great resolution on this image, I've cut the little discussion of my diagram down to a very, very minimal. But I'm going to paint this on a barn somewhere, and I'm happy to take questions about it afterwards. So I'll just dim the lights a little if we can, if that doesn't put you too to sleep. Okay. So the title of my talk, I forgot I needed to add one word to it, is What Remains, What Returns, Garbage, Ghosts, and the End of Cinema Today. When and where does one begin to think about the end or ends of cinema? What here and now does one occupy? Or what then and there and future tense where does one conjure and conjugate in identifying an end, an expiration or death, and in elaborating the ends, an aim, a teleology, or anticipated destination of cinema? In his 1946 Le mythe du cinéma total et les origines du cinématographe, a thesis on cinema's ends as origin, André Bazin asserted that cinema, and I quote, was still in the process of being invented. In 1958, so 12 years later, in his revision of the myth essay for What is Cinema, he went further to note that such a cinema, and I quote again, had not yet been invented. The realization of the mythic total cinema evoked in Bazin's much discussed article would necessarily be an end of cinema as telos, but I suspect it would also be an end to corps, an apocalypse. For what else could one call the full integration of living reality and its totality of images and sounds? So cinema, a myth. Cinemas, on the other hand, in the multitude of local configurations, surely exist throughout the world. As the most interesting creators, archivists, and scholars remind us, and as I've gotten a deeper sense over the course of our collective conversations this weekend. Now, an obligation to continually provincialize cinema, to borrow a concept from Dipesh Chakravarti and his Provincializing Europe. So an obligation to provincialize cinema, to not hastily think or write of cinema and its end and ends in a universalizing, generalized singular, but rather to emphasize its localisms from which one theorizes and historicizes, now subtend much of the work in the field. With these necessary nuances in mind, I wish to address what remains and what returns across a large swath of cinematic iterations that are, to draw from Chakravarti once more, held together by a negative universal history, driven by entropic forces of human-generated global climate change and attendant ecological catastrophes and extinctions, frequently, if not without controversy, referred to as the Anthropocene. And this is a concept that I believe Alex Bush said really nicely yesterday, needs to always be thought in terms of the politics and the distribution of proximity to the dangers of the Anthropocene. So it's only half thought if you're not thinking biopolitics with the Anthropocene. So returning to my opening question, when and where does one begin to think about the end or ends of cinema? And how does it inflect the object of inquiry? I offer a provisional answer through remnants and revenants, what remains and what returns, through, as the title promised, garbage and ghosts. Which is to say, through an attention to cinema's relationship with a stubborn materiality, garbage, and a haunting ephemerality, ghosts. If cinema ends, and it has had many, it also endures. Now, through my attention to garbage and ghosts as both the essential and essentially unassimilable elements of cinema, I also hope to underline how well-suited cinema and cinema studies are for responding to a question posed by the editors of the 2017 collection, Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, Ghosts and Monsters in the Anthropocene. And so let me just quote that question. How shall we return to the productive horror of our civilization? How shall we retain the productive horror of our civilization and yet refute its inevitability? So my paper is going to proceed in two parts. The first part gives a longer explication of Siegfried Kracauer's and Georges Bataille's thinking from the late 1920s on the historiographical dimensions of photographic media in terms of some horizons of finitude. The shorter second part remarks upon our roughly contemporaneous moment and speculative futures, in which questions of the end and ends of cinema converge with a heightened attunement to human-generated climate chaos and extinction, in which garbage and ghosts may be the very emblems of our time. But first, a brief word on ghosts. What is a ghost? And I'm sorry, is the mic okay? Is that working all right? What is a ghost? A ghost is a mode of address, but also much more. It is an actualization of or incorporeal manifestation of seemingly incompossible configurations of time and space. Ghostly apparitions help focalize and even reorient the attention of the living to consider alternative configurations of space-time, presence, and being. Folklore traditions across the globe have conceived at least key species of ghosts as figures for the enduring but repressed or unattended to injustices, or as harbingers of present or future dangers. Ghosts call for the haunted to bear witness, to take account, and even to become responsible to an untimely call for justice. In this respect, ghosts occasion a particular spectatorial experience characterized by astonishment and ethical appeal. And during the long 20th century, cinema has provided the most common ghostly medium. Now, in anticipation of this paper's own end and ends, I ask through an appeal to the cineast Momoko Seto, in the so-called era of post-cinema, if it is time to call for a post-human account of ghosts. Now, in asking this question, of course, a chorus of ghosts might reply, "We have never been human," or "We have always already been post-human." For it is one of the conditions of possibility of ghosts to be, most precisely, post-human, a form of afterlife, or an excess of the finitude of human being. And okay, fair enough. So allow me to reformulate my question with greater nuance, or at least a little more lucid humility. Have the scholarly conceptions of ghosts as modes of address, and perhaps much more, been themselves haunted by a limiting anthropomorphism? How and to what purposes might we pursue a de- or non-anthropomorphized, and maybe even non-anthropocentric vision of ghosts? How, for example, might one think haunting at a planetary level? And a question I ask knowing that today, May 5th, is the 200th birthday of Karl Marx, someone who thought a lot about ghosts and planets and haunting. So I ask this in order to approach a geo- and ecopolitics of spectrality, which is to say, an account of ghost planets that haunt our present and our future. In the vernacular of astronomy, ghost planets refer to the hypothetical or empirically unproven planets, ones that are indirectly suggested by data or fleetingly observed. In an era marked by ecological precarity, anthropogenic climate destabilization, and widespread extinctions and environmental degradation, might the question of the ghostliness of our own planet merit reflection in terms of both astronomical, spectral, or at least cinematic thought. Okay, so now the long and kind of perversely detailed section 1. Media hauntologies, Kracauer with Bataille. Now, at the close of the 1920s, as the transition to sound film was making industrial headway in North America, in Europe, in Asia, which is to say, a moment when many obituaries were being written for cinema as a silent art and a universal language, Siegfried Kracauer and Georges Bataille published articles on the historiographic dimensions of photographic media, oriented toward horizons of obsolescence and dislocation, detours and uncertain ends. With curious symmetry, Kracauer's October 1927 Die Photographie, or photography, and Bataille's April 1929 Figur humaine, or human face, or the human figure, contrasted photographic portraits and film stills from previous generations, their grandparents' and parents' generations, with an unprinted photograph of an unnamed film starlet at the beach. So they both have this strange kind of comparative model where they're thinking about their grandparents and they're thinking about an unnamed starlet who will not appear in the article. Now, together, the essays draft a research program for thinking the ends and afterwards of photographic media at the level of individual example and cumulative effects that theorize photo and cinematographic capture and storage by means of their affinities with garbage and ghosts. For Kracauer, the stakes of his project involve nothing less than the go-for-broke game of history, in which photographic and cinematic images might train us to apprehend something of the material base and contingent nature of capitalist modernity. For Bataille, the stakes involve what Georges Didi Huberman has designated as a withering critique of anthropomorphism, and the art historian Linda Steer discusses as a vision of history as monstrous. Now, I'm going to bracket for the moment Kracauer's and Bataille's differences to draw out some of the productive overlaps through this textual explication, before attending quite briefly to how their divergent conjuring of ghosts offer distinct pressures on concepts of history and temporality. I've written forthcoming pieces on both Kracauer's and Bataille's relationship to a critical conception of natural history that dialectically thinks human and more than human temporalities and histories together, primarily with an emphasis on questions of animality and environment. So if I return to these texts again, it's because I sense there's still some unfinished business. Now, for Kracauer, and by the way, there's Maya Deren in Kracauer, one of the coolest parties that probably happened in New York. If I return to these texts again, it's for the reasons I just said. There's some unfinished business. For Kracauer, photographic media posed both a problem and a solution for historical reflection. They initially appeared and were marked as a technical realization of historicist fantasies of total preservation of the past, an inventory of everything. But in practice, the use value of photographs dramatically changed as they accumulated and aged. As an archive, as Miriam Hansen observes, photographic media are rather unstable. Kracauer's essay opens with an experiment in temporal stereography, wherein he compares a contemporary photograph of a 24-year-old demonic diva taken at the beach in Lido, and that's not the picture, I just chose that one, in September of that year, with that of a photographic portrait taken over 60 years earlier of a grandmother as a 24-year-old woman in a crinoline dress with a chignon bun. From this comparison, he determines that as the passage of time or rapid global circulation separates photographic media from their initial context of production and reception, the cultural logic that maintains the apparent unity of the image and what it depicts begins to erode, but also become opaque. Arguing photographic media appear as what he calls in his 1931 essay on the destruction of the Berlin's Linder Arcade, a species of homeless image, and excuse my almost non-existent German, the term in German is obdachlos Bilder. So he describes these as a kind of homeless image, and I like the resonance that this will have with the thinking of homelessness that Kracauer will do, and I'll come back to that in my last line. Now, with the passage of time or decontextualization, the coherence of the image becomes perceptible as mere spatial contiguity, and its contents appear as contingent and fragmentary. In its afterlife, thanks to the anthropological indifference of the camera's impassive lens and sensitive substrate, the legibility and content of a photographic document may become radically different from that which its initial users saw in it. The grandmother, outfitted in a heavy crinoline dress, fades from the picture as a distinct individual, and over time resembles less a person than a mannequin upon which to display the curious fashions of yesteryear. I quote Kracauer, "The truth content of the original is left behind in its history. The photograph captures only the residuum that history has discharged," close quote. Now, of this discharge, Kracauer notes, and I quote again, photography appears as a jumble that consists primarily of garbage. In the German, there's Abfallen. And elsewhere, he'll say in the essay that photography appears as a stockpile of elements and as remnants of nature. Now, the aged or decontextualized photograph resembles a junkyard, a shipwreck, or haunted house, in which disintegration of its structures sometimes produces the spacing for new forms to emerge. Kracauer imagined photographic media to be suffused by a negativity that swallows the grandmother from her portrait, producing what Jennifer Fay, in her essay Antarctica and Krakauer's Cold Love, provocatively calls a significant whole, H-O-L-E, from which a productively alienated and even alien mode of vision and historical analysis may be practiced. To quote Kracauer again, what appears in the photograph is not the person, but the sum of what can be subtracted from him or her, close quote. What we see in old photographs is a disintegrated unity, in which the various elements held together by familiarity or ideology in the original context become estranged from each other and from us, taking on appearances of an unredeemed ghostly reality that causes a shudder. And like any good ghost story, there's 3 times that a ghost will appear in this text and 3 moments of shudder. Krakauer's essay marks the non-appearance of something ghostly with 3 shudders, and these cause both laughter and disquiet. I will quote, I've got 2 more big quotes from Kracauer, and then the deep explication will stop, and I'll get a little more fleet-footed. So I quote again from Kracauer. Now the image wanders ghost-like through the present, like a lady of the haunted castle. Spooky apparitions occur only in places where a terrible deed has been committed. The photograph becomes a ghost because the costumed mannequin was once alive, close quote. Aging photographic media bear traces of something dead, insisting upon the present, but also mark the unsettling experience of knowing that we too will be swallowed whole, unredeemed, by and in time's maw. Now, for Kracauer, the capacities of photography were potentially intensified, but also radicalized by film and cinema. The other day, the question of what's film versus cinema came up, and my favorite answer to that is Gilbert Cohen-Seat in 1946 said that film is the text and the substrate, cinema is everything related to it, and that's outside of it. It's a kind of beautiful sense of that distinction. So for Kracauer, these capacities became radicalized by moving images. And I quote again, the disorder of the detritus reflected in photography cannot be elucidated more clearly than through the suspension, Aufhebung, of every habitual relationship among the elements of nature. The capacity to stir up the elements of nature is one of the possibilities of film. This possibility is realized whenever film combines parts and segments to create strange constructs, close quote. It is not just costume and fashion that photography and film can reveal to be contingent, but our perceptions of inhuman nature too, which no longer appear as transhistorical givens. Alluding to the ghostly effects of photographs and old newsreels, such as those projected at the Studio des Ursulines in Paris, and that's Kracauer's reference, Kracauer's media ecology emphasizes the power of film to animate and actualize the productive negativity and alienation of photographic images. Photographs for Kracauer suspend. Kracauer's use of the Hegelian term Aufhebung to describe photography's treatment of the relations to detritus and milieu suggests an abolishing negation, an overcoming that is at once the preservation and transformation of what the camera captures. Films, on the other hand, agitate. They potentially stir up and set in motion new relations among nature's heterogeneous elements, particularly through the strange constructs, the creative anatomy, geography, and historiography made possible by juxtaposition, montage, and spatial and temporal dislocations. Kracauer continued to think film and cinema through garbage and ghosts. And this is apparent in some of Marian Hansen's examinations of his 1940 notes, written in Marseille, for what would become eventually the theory of film project. And I quote once more, "Film does not aim upward toward intention, but pushes toward the bottom, to gather and carry along even the dregs. It is interested in the refuse, in what is just there, both in and outside the human being. The face counts for nothing in film unless it includes the death's head beneath," close quote. Now, by learning to attend to Kracauer's understanding of photographic media, one may develop sensitivities to perceiving the present in manners that reveal the contingency of what might otherwise be mistaken for necessary, and the fragility of what might otherwise be taken for durable and solid. Kracauer believed one could train one's perception to recognize in all images the historical contingency of the spatial continuum captured by photographic media, and to regard with a critical eye the garbage and ghosts latent in every movie. Now, from this perspective, every film might take on the appearance of Georges Lacombe's 1928 La Zone. So I would say what we just saw there, Kracauer was training himself and trying to train his readers to recognize in all assortment of images. Now, I have not yet, and I don't have any cute childhood pictures of Bataille, sorry. I have not yet found evidence that Bataille was familiar with Kracauer's account of photographic media, but his 1929 essay, Figure Humaine, which one may translate, as I mentioned, as human figure, human form even, or human face, also thinks the historiographic dimensions of photographic media through remnants and revenants, framed by considerations of photographs of previous generations compared with that of a moving picture of, and I quote, "the planet Earth trampled underfoot by a dazzling American film star in a bathing suit." And that's an image that he recognizes in the conclusion of the essay would also fall into obsolescence in time. And there's perhaps an example. I like this picture of the beach because they're wearing heels, and talon is the word that Bataille uses in the French, and so heel as in high heel could be what he's meaning. Okay. Oh, and I think my guess is that Karl Einstein, the German art historian, was the one who, if there's a direct contact, may have apprised Bataille to Kracauer's work, but I'm not sure. I haven't done the archival research. Okay, so Bataille's essay stages a conversation with 24 found photographs and film stills, including a photograph of a provincial wedding party from 1905, and numerous portraits of stage and film performers taken at Nadar's studio in Paris. Like Kracauer, Bataille sees in aging photographs and film something both comical and distressing, and I quote, "The mere sight in photography of our predecessors in the occupation of this country now produces, for varying reasons, a burst of loud and raucous laughter." And that could also be translated as lacerating and imbecilic laughter. That sight, however, is nonetheless hideous, close quote. If the strange fashions and affectations of humans cause laughter, the hideousness of such aging photographic images, to Bataille's eyes, please, was not just the fact that they constituted a haunting of the living by the dead, but that they did so in such a diminished and lamentably banal manner. Such effigies hardly lived up to the task of either marking the radical irrecoverability of the past or the disturbances its purchase upon the presence may cause. He thus calls for ghosts adequate to such a task. even as he found something shabby and depressing in the accumulation of such ancestral effigies in the forms of portrait photography and the cast-off accoutrements of fashion, such as whalebone corsets and crinoline dresses, which he believed were growing moldy in the attics across France. These abandoned fashions and absurd ghosts had a heuristic value for him. Bataille saw in photographs of predecessors the negation of claims to an eternal human nature. He invited readers to not see stable documents functioning by means of the principle of identity, but rather records of non-relation, disproportion, and the absence of common measure that revealed discontinuity between humans and nature, and discontinuity between present and past, but also within the present itself. Now, if I've spent a perverse amount of time doing a kind of close and maybe lowball reading of these two texts on a Saturday morning, it's not just because of my perversity. I hope that this explication of Kracauer's and Bataille's texts has helped develop a sense in which both of these thinkers were trying to rehearse experimental protocols of perception. We might also call those historiography, through the medium's residues and surpluses in the form of a negative theology of the image. They presented photographic and cinematic archives as an inventory of cast-offs and strange offsprings. Where Kracauer saw a possibility of the redemption of physical reality and the development of historical insight in a critical regard trained by photographic media, Bataille learned from photographs and films to view the present as absolutely heterogeneous and the past as monstrous, shifting attention from a model of history concerned with origins to one focused on effects. In the final part of this paper now, addressed to the today in my title, and really to the work of reflecting upon cinema's end and ends in the Anthropocene, I'll try to give one tentative example of what a response to Bataille's call for ghosts adequate to our age and to the disproportionate scales of not just a medium, but a planet in crisis might look like, with the help of the Japanese-born, French-based contemporary filmmaker Momoko Seto, in her series of short speculative documentaries, Planet Alpha from 2008, Planet Zeta from 2011, Planet Sigma from 2014, and Planet Infinity from 2017, which was produced as a VR movie. Out of curiosity, has anyone seen any of Momoko Seto's work? Okay, when you have Google and some adult time, look up her pink films. They're really fantastic. I'll show you some clips as I talk. So final section, shortest section, ghost planets. If Kracauer and Bataille belong to a long tradition of thinkers who understand cinema as a ghostly medium, we late-born may also understand that cinema, in its variant forms, is a medium whose industrial production, distribution, exhibition, and conservation requires incredible resource expenditures. Garbage and ghosts are not just the privileged content of photographic and cinematic images, at least Shea, Kracauer, and Bataille, but also a significant byproduct of its making. Garbage, detritus, and industrial byproducts, not unlike ghosts, have a way of haunting, of sticking around as a disturbing reminder of the presence of the past and the limits of the future. This is particularly so for many of the marvelous forms of digital and post-cinema. Now, one of my wonderful former graduate students, whose name is Gabrielle Dupuis, and I know she's not watching this, but if she was, she would have just gotten a shout out. She brought to my attention a series of studies collated by Greenpeace in 2015 and then updated in 2017 on the carbon footprint and energy demands of data storage and video streaming. The reports cite a series of studies that storage and streaming draw about 12% of the global electricity demand, 12% of the global electricity demand. And this figure is expected to rise by as much as 7% annually over the next decade. So we are watching pornography into extinction, and YouTube videos, and binge watching Netflix. So everything wonderful. Now, in this context of cinema's ends and new means, as well as the context of increasing planetary precarity, it's in this context that Momoko Seto's work conjures ghosts adequate to the scale of some of the terrors of our time, as well as to the perceptual pedagogy of Kracauer's account of photographic media. Seto's Planet series tried to imagine landscapes simultaneously primeval and post-catastrophic, before and after the end, in which humans appear to have no place, but that we haunt and are haunted by all the same. Here, we are the ghosts. These films ask us to try to imagine worlds, and perhaps the world, apart from ourselves, our ends, if only to better understand our implications in and with them. Each of her ghost planets, as hypotheticals to return to the idiom of astronomers, is potentially the one that we inhabit and collectively destroy, often with an unsettling beauty. Her films are laboratories of decay and proliferation, setting up experimental milieus and second nature environments and allowing entropy to take its uncharted course. She produces strange constructs through time-lapse and accelerated filming and digital compositing that bring together heterotemporal processes of high-speed photography, and you'll see in the next clip a bee flying in slow motion, and time-lapse photography, the growth of mushrooms and molds and slime molds in a single visual field, giving concrete forms to the surreal nature of climate chaos. Now, each of her films presents the emergence, dehiscence, and mysterious destruction of a planet, which is often revealed at some point in the film to be some common organic matter, such as salt crystals, a rotting orange, or moldy berries, filmed with extreme magnification and temporal manipulation. And so that is the surface of an orange there, I believe. Now, Seto's movies invite us to learn to see our own troubled present with the eyes attentive to remnants and revenants, to what goes, comes back, sticks around, and disappears. This optic may provide a strategy of survival in the era where the transformation of milieus, ecosystems, and the planet trigger increasingly surreal events, and where the surrealism of the past urgently beacons to and even becomes our all too real present, and the ghost planet flickering before us is in the process of being born. So to wrap up, I might simply say that one of the lessons from the history of cinema, an invention still in the making or not yet invented, to return to Bazin's formulation, is that it's always been ends-oriented, always ending. Or to return to Kracauer, cinema has been a homeless shelter, a factory of homeless images, a haunted house, and both source and remedy for homesickness. So, in the end, what is cinema? Cinema is what remains, and cinema is what returns. Thank you. We'll just let the decay gotta go. This is up on Arte. It's a VR project, and so excuse me, that's me trying to navigate the world to watch molds fall down like rain. That's it.
Thank you so much, James, for altering our perceptions and taking us from bright morning into shadowy night. Okay, but we have plenty of time for questions. So questions for James.
Oops. I'll just say there's a very long history of trying to imagine the world before humans and the world without humans. And so one of the archives I'm starting to dip into pretty strongly is 19th century vernacularization of paleontology. And so these beautiful images, which become the source for people like Max Ernst and other avant-garde artists of the kind of primeval world, which is always promising a catastrophe to come.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic. May I have the image you started from, the first image?
My chart?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, good.
Because if you look attentively, there is a back of this sheet.
Yes. Oh my
And
God.
it's exactly the ghost that is in this image. So and also maybe a waste because you throw away something.
Yeah.
So let's, thank you so much. I want to go back to Kracauer
Yeah, please.
and your terrific reading of this text on photography. There is a moment in which he says there is a disaster. And the moment is when the photography, because it's so common, it's so spread out, it doesn't mean any longer anything. It's this loss of meaning that make possible for photography to make room to cinema that through montage provide a risky meaning that the photography lost. So from this point of view, I completely agree with you, but I would say that there are moments in which the media are ripe, and that's the moment in which they collapse.
Yes.
And when they collapse is on another medium to take care of them. So the question is, yes, cinema maybe is still in the moment in which it start to live or it start to find its own destiny. But which other media took care of cinema in the moment of ripeness, waste, and ghost?
Oh, that is, I hope someone recorded that. That was a beautiful and generous question. And one, in a way, I need to do more work to give a satisfying answer to that, because which medium takes care of cinema? Because I mean, I think Momoko Seto is trying to
Definitely, yes.
put this out, and so it's these forms of post-cinema. And I should say, I hope this was clear, that like as I'm doing the kind of work to learn about the calories that these different media and all media have, caloric intakes and are energy horny, and I'm not trying to say we shouldn't make films, but that I think these are experiments that are, I think you put it perfectly, like giving cinema a different space and trying to, push forward, as cinema also is on a verge of perhaps its own collapse, its own disaster. And so, yeah, I've become, after spending the whole part of my career thinking about the 20s and 30s, I'm excited to try to think about the 2020s and 30s and see if we can get some interesting ideas. So, thank you.
Yeah, could I ask a question kind of following up on that? At the end of the photography essay, Kracauer talks about these strange constructs jumbling the order of nature. Yeah. And I think one of the words he uses is that we've lost the correct order of things. And I've always read this as a loss of our criteria for what constitutes authenticity, let's say. But then, thinking about it further, I wonder if even the word correct is the appropriate term here, because it seems, as you reference Hegel, it seems like the notion of correctness is only possible after a certain episteme or a certain phase of history has passed. thinking about the Owl of Minerva and Aufhebung and all this. So I'm wondering if this formulation from Kracauer is maybe too Hegelian, that this idea of correctness, this idea of an order of nature that is the right one, and having a medium that reflects that correctly is already problematic. I wonder what you think about that.
Oh, Stephen, every time you've asked me a question, it's been like such a gift. So thank you for this. And they're always so precise. You're absolutely, I totally agree with you. And I think that this is a moment where, the long and glorious Hegelian hangover is still really, really at play. And this is where in the conversation with Bataille, and I just for time and because I knew I was going to be doing a lot of reading, I didn't want to punish the audience too much, but that human face figure humaine essay is precisely a critique of Hegel's theses on nature. Now, Bataille in later life will admit that he's anti-Hegelian, but only through very Hegelian means. So even he is thinking dialectically, but he won't call it that. But my desire to put these two into conversation, besides the interesting structural homologies, is precisely to kind of correct what you've better than I had quite identified it, the kind of the false sense of certainty that one could have, that moment of slippage from a genuine historical contingency to a value judgment that might be hasty. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Thanks for that. I have a weird observation, maybe a question. So during your talk, and especially about the crinolines, I got distracted and thought about this weird tradition of deliberately concealed clothing that dates back to the Middle Ages, where people in the West would shove stomachers and waistcoats and three-pointed hats into buildings, and they're being rediscovered, and people are like, why? And it seems to be the answer is magic, of course, right? So charm. So I wanted, so to make sense of that, or to justify geeking out over that in relation to what you're saying, is I wanted to think about, or ask you about another axis that leads from ghosts, which might be magic, right? Which would connect ghost to waste or excess or surplus in a different way.
Yeah.
Like thinking about the stuff that gets repurposed as a charm or a talisman to ward against demise or doom or whatever. So I'd love to hear what you would do with that.
I mean, the quickest answer I would give, I'll give two quick answers. One would be that that's the fetish quality of the photographic image as a barrier against death. And so I love, now you've contaminated me beautifully with the idea that people are trying to walk through walls and getting stuck and disintegrating, and that's why their clothes are stuck there. But the other thing, and I thought this drawing I made in a graduate seminar would have been more gloriously clear, but Pepper's ghost, magic, and magic lanterns. Magic is absolutely part of this growing kind of spiral of history. And this origins, which, again, I hope I don't embarrass people, Alex said was a burst, right? or a star. I thought of it as a star, as a disaster. But it's also the angel of history, looking at the accumulating waste products of a history of media and of, so that would be those would be my two answers. And that's a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. That was really a stunning presentation. I have a question that I think takes off from Stephen's about Kracauer. And I mean, obviously the one way you could read it is in terms of a call for evaluation and correctness, et cetera. But I've always seen it somewhat differently. The attack, the polemic for Kracauer is against historicism. And he sees historicism in terms of continuity. And the problem with the photograph is that there is no gap, no absence. It's an attempt to cover everything.
Yeah.
And historicism sees history as a gradual piling up of everything.
Yeah.
So that from one point of view, you could see the problem for Kracauer in historicism is the absence of lack, or the absence of absences, or the absence of forgetting, in a way.
Yeah.
So that the problem is really that nothing is thrown away. And I'm wondering if you've thought about that in relation to digital media, which seems to exacerbate the problem. So the problem is not of garbage, but that everything is there. Everything is always already there. There's no forgetting. There's no throwing away.
Yeah. No, that's right. And that's part of the critique of historicism will be put against the memory image, right? And that will be that highly selective and all the forgetting. So it's the last image that one holds. And so, yeah, and again, just in my haste, I underplayed a bit the kind of critique of historicism, but you're right. So much of the importance of that is the selection and forgetting process. Now, the connection to the digital, and I'm probably a digital hoarder, so I know the terror, and I know how it slows and troubles your life, because it slows down everything, and it's energy, and this is the big problem for engineers, and I'm not saying we go back to paper and pencil, but one of the problems is that this storage takes energy. And we know that to conserve films properly also takes energy. Everything takes energy. But we're getting to a moment where, as we decide what kind of distributions of living and dying we're going to allow, and what kind of resource, in a weird way, I do think that this is a problem that cinema has to figure out. The other place I've been going, and I hope this is I'm doing more than just dancing around this really excellent question, is I've been reading back through a lot of third cinema and different kind of critical practices from the 60s and 70s. And one of the texts that really has struck me is the Imperfect Cinema essay. And then the Return to the Imperfect Cinema essay 15 years later, where the question is, are we going to be for the culture of waste or the culture of kind of liberation? And I think that's actually our question. That's what's been posed. And so I don't have the answers. I can read Kracauer. I'm hoping to get something smart out of this, but I think this is the challenge.
First of all, I just want to thank you, James, for that beautiful, beautiful talk, which was also incredibly insightful and generative, but just so wonderfully organized and enchanting. So my question is very basic, and I'm going to start off by apologizing for it. But I want to go back to the starlets and invite you to talk about the role that gender is playing in, the feminization of waste. And I think you showed us a beautiful example of the non-anthropomorphized ghost in Seto's films. And yet it seems to me that in order to get there, we must also tarry with gender.
Yeah. And this morning as I was getting my PowerPoint slides together, I was like, I will get this question, and I know I'm not going to yet have a satisfying answer, but it is absolutely, and it's absolutely something that when I was thinking about, of course they go to, an unshone woman as bearing the kind of burden of this. For Bataille, weirdly, it becomes, it's still fraught with the kind of problematics of a masculinist imaginary, but he actually thinks that the image of young Americans, but it's women, so again, is the kind of antidote to all the problems of a weighed down culture. But so I guess what I would do is ask you to help me better think this out, because this is, I will admit, it's something that I knew I would be asked, and I had not yet thought through in a good way an answer to this. But I will say the other thing, Momoko Seto is someone for whom so much of her work is interrogating questions of gender. And that's where the Pink films and the larger body of her work becomes really interested. Because she's interested in, I don't want to put these words in her mouth because they're not hers, but what seems to me a kind of thinking through a queer ecology. and the kind of affiliations that a lot of the interesting work in kind of from Donna Haraway, Mel Chen, and others are thinking through. And that I'm a slow thinker, so I'm yet to get fleet-footed on like how to get them, their proper justice. But thank you for that question. It's absolutely right.
Thank you, James. I'm going to peer a little bit into the abyss because I can't quite get past that figure you gave, that 12% of the world's energy.
Oh, yeah.
It goes into letting me watch Arrested Development on my phone in the airport.
Yeah.
Which is kind of horrifying, right? And a lot of your talk is about decay. That's decadent in kind of the worst possible way. So, the picture or the clip, the trash picker is recycling metal, or even the rot on the oranges, right? These are sort of generative relationships to waste, and kind of potentially legible as Marxist salvage or so on. But if 12% of the world's energy is going to streaming video, that makes me think of something else like Bitcoin, which uses massive amounts of electrical and computing power for what, right? So I guess I'm going to ask you to kind of reflect on this kind of nightmare scenario, right? That we're not creating new life in the form of slime molds on the decay of an old orange, right? But a new awful financialization.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. And I haven't yet done the work, and I need to speak to many smart people in this room and elsewhere to get the right sources to begin thinking through this. But I can't help, and it's my own selection bias, of thinking of Bitcoin and data mining as being part of the accursed share. It's this form of expenditure and reckless luxury that, in a way, now you know who my other North or my South Star might be. But so yeah, I've been thinking about these questions and trying not to be, too like vulgar Marxist about it, but really thinking about, this is the political access of this work, and it is absolutely, I wrote this piece about YouTube and thought a lot about it, and then I was like, oh, this is actually the kind of surface of a form of, as it's trying to capture, nature and capture animal and capture contingency, there's an incredible energy debt that's going directly into the kind of, destruction of the environments that are being, stored as, to cite Akira Lippert, electric animals. And so just trying to think out this economy of energy is I think, the work to come. And so if you've got sources or better, that's a great idea, and it's absolutely right. Other ideas about this, I'm open to them and eager.
Hi, James. Thank you for that great talk.
Thanks.
So, of course, every organism produces waste,
Yes.
right? So if we think about photochemical film as producing one order of waste, we might think about digital cinema, or whatever it is, producing a different scale of waste, which is, I think, what you were just talking about. But of course, as you know, there's a really long history of images like Momoko Seto's film, of scientific films of organisms and mold growing and so on and so forth. And you know this as well as anyone here. So my question was about the kind of shiny digital quality of her films. And it made me think about the newness of them. So of course, Kracauer is talking about this sort of discharge of old images in the present, which only happens because they have aged. So if we're watching Seto's films or digital videos, which have not yet aged, what do we do with this sort of shiny digital newness of them?
This is a great question. And the best questions, and I hope this isn't a cop-out and people can pull me aside, but the best questions are the ones you can't answer. And that's what I'm getting today, which means I've done my job and you're doing a beautiful job. I mean, the thing I'd honestly been thinking about with Momoko Seto is the real strong influence of anime, and particularly with the bee and I'll just put it up again. The bee and the mushrooms growing. And I think there's almost an intentional cheesiness. You're right about the surface sheen. But to my mind, and I don't know anime super well, but I do recognize the mushrooms. And again, we'll be talking to people like Thomas Lamar and other people who can educate me better. Sorry, I'm trying to get there, and now it's refusing to let me go. But I think it is about a kind of playing with a certain at least in this image, a certain aesthetic ugliness of the kind of incompossible temporalities and the kind of wholly artificial and kind of cheesy scales of it. Do you have a kind of further push on the question of the shininess? Because you're right, again, like the whole argument about Kracauer and the way that discharge happens there has to be then complicated if I'm going to bring it forward.
Yeah, I don't know that I want to take up more time with it. Maybe we can
Yeah.
talk about it later.
No, but that's a great question. That's really, really right, I think.
Thank you so much, James, for a wonderful talk. I've barely drunk any of my coffee because your talk was so energizing. I wanted to go back to Caitlin's question about women and gender, which is obviously a big part of what the photographic archive that you showed us is doing. And I think what you're really getting from gender in these images, these old photographs of women, is a kind of a heuristic approach to absurdity, which is obviously really, really important, particularly for Bataille. As you put it, quoting Bataille, there's a kind of heuristic value of abandoned fashion and absurd ghosts. And what makes these images of women absurd is, how quickly female clothing becomes outdated because of the cycles of commodity fetishism, and then immediately appears ridiculous to us, right? Like, there's nothing more absurd than an image of a woman in a, crinoline dress and hoop skirt. And I'm wondering, just in terms of your wager, to think haunting on a planetary scale and de-anthropomorphize ghosts, and just to try to unpack this connection from the old photos of women to the kind of new, to the ghost planet media, where or whether you see absurdity in Momoko Seto's films, because that's just methodologically really important to what you're doing, how you're thinking about ghosts and garbage.
Like, Maggie, you always make me smarter. I will say, like, if you haven't read Maggie's book, read it. But like, I thought your critique and extension of something I wrote was like beautifully done, and this is another example of that. You're right. I mean, like, Seto's work, the work that's not the Planet films really is absurd and really is about, in this kind of tradition of the kind of grotesque and the comic in that sense. And I think those images of the mushrooms, these what I'm calling anime mushrooms, hints at that within the sobriety of the kind of Jean Commandant tradition of scientific observation of time-lapse things. It's introducing the kind of anime spark to it, and it's detorning it a bit. The leap and the jump from the questions, which are absolutely right, about the labor and work that the absurd fashions are doing, and that the fashions, in Bataille's essay, he actually goes at the men as well and talks about the ridiculous beards and stuff, but it really is so weighted on the crinoline dress, these, as you know better than anyone, these very dangerous outfits. And so I think the jump from 1929 to 2008, there's a bit of explaining to do, and so that is the conceptual. That's one of the next conceptual steps, I think, that I'll take. So thank you, thanks. And this, I don't know your name, but that person has had her hand up a really long time. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to snatch that out of you.
This, if you want, you can just leave this as a comment, because I'm not quite sure if I've really fully articulated this as a question. I'm not a film scholar at all, although you've convinced me maybe I'm a cinema scholar, if it's everything around. So.
Yeah, exactly. You're in the room.
So I was very drawn to just one reference about Le Zone and that Lacombe piece, which I had never seen before, but I'm fascinated by it. I'm actually very interested in the history of Le Zone in Paris, which is kind of getting some attention now, and kind of as an urbanist and as a geographer, I'm wondering sort of what function that road, which I guess is now the highway around Paris, plays. And I've just discovered, the Apollinaire poem, Le Zone, and Beckett's translation of it. So I'm just kind of wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about sort of the role that Le Zone plays in your argument.
Yeah. So this Georges Lacombe film, which someone has put online now, so you can watch it. The Cinematheque did restore it, so hopefully it will get some circulation. But La Zone, for those who aren't urbanists or lovers of French modernist prose, and Blaise Cendrars is also another person who goes to La Zone to eat bird tongue salad and this kind of stuff. It was the old zone between the gates of medieval Paris and then the kind of extension of the city, and it was a basically unincorporated area outside of the official infrastructure. So it's precisely one of these spaces of proximity to danger and death, you know, the exact like biopolitical mapping of a city, but also one of the spaces of insurgency and kind of counterculture and of racial integration. It's pretty much, I think, the first place in Paris where real racial integration is happening. For the work, for me, I'm interested in these questions of waste and the circulation of garbage. And so the film both became a kind of emblem of what I see Kracauer rehearsing in the way he's training his perception to see the kind of contingency and detritus in what appears coherent. And that becomes a moment of a kind of firm historical reference for it. And I think that a film like La Zone, I haven't looked into whether Kracauer wrote about it, but it's the kind of film that he certainly, and maybe Stephen or Nick knows, but it's certainly the kind of film he would have dug.
So quickly, thanks, James. The Kracauer essay that I was thinking of, especially when you got to the Momoko Seto stuff, was mass ornament.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about, you know, when you want to think about this present moment, to go back to that early moment where you have, he talks about capitalism as creating these ornaments that the human is left out of. So it's another attempt to imagine or create a world without the human, but produced by, in fact, capitalism of the early and industrialism of the early 20th century. So, you know, I'm just a suggestion that essay seems to me to be one that would be interesting to put in dialect or in dialogue with the present. So.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. Thank you. And in a expanded version of this, that would be something that would necessarily be in there. Thank you, though.
We're going to have 2 more quick questions. Hi, James. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I've been thinking about some of the things that came up during your talk, and I want to talk a little bit, or ask you a question about the time-lapse video that you showed us with Momoko Seto and the relationship with magic. There is a long, like you said, there's a long history of those type of time-lapse videos, and especially the plants, the germination of plants and blooming. And these films were kind of an example of cinema as an incontestable miracle, right? And I want to think, I've been thinking about miracle a lot in addition to magic of cinema, and that religious kind of aspect that miracles have, that perhaps magic allows us to bypass as we think about this as tricks and more technological. But there's a religious sensibility, perhaps, if not a formalized religion specifically to speak of, but a religious sensibility that I think maybe also opens us to thinking about beyond the human. And then, I'm just kind of wondering, once again, to invoke the ghost of Marx, like religion not as the opiate of the masses, but perhaps something that is worth thinking about in this recycling, the garbage, the ghost, and gods, perhaps.
Yeah. No, that's a really astute and nice connection to make. And I think like the theory of film, and again, there's real Kracauer experts. I'm like the teenager who just discovered hip hop, and I'm going to tell everyone about it. But as I'm recollecting it, one of the kind of problems that Kracauer is thinking is the kind of absence of a stable system of meaning, right? And how one orients and lives through world once those kind of master narratives, such as religion, no longer are doing the work that they used to do, and that, new physics didn't quite become the religion, or, the sciences that are beyond empirical observation, that are largely theoretical in their accounts, don't quite do that work. So cinema plays that role, and you're absolutely right that it is written about. I know the French context the best, but everyone goes just ape over flower films and about the intoxication and the beauty and the magic and the associations to ballet. And I know in the German context, there's like Blumenwunder and all those great films. So it's parallel tracks are happening, and it's precisely. I mean, one could say it's a kind of like secular, miracle or secular religious. It's filling some of that role, and the way in which the nature has a kind of relationship to these sublime or these larger than the human experiences. I think that's right on point. So thank you.
One more question. Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo everybody's thanks, James, for a really delightful way to start the day. I think what's in your talk, and I think what I'm going to say is a little bit related to Marianne's question about the relationship of like all this excess and fullness and this aesthetics of excess and fullness, and then the dialectic that it's in with, right, a simplicity or an emptiness. It's interesting to me that the wasteland as a term invokes a kind of barren space, right? And the sort of, I'm interested in the historical shift of our anxiety about the end of the world being shifting from, in the kind of nuclear era or the Cold War era, one of sort of devastation and erasure of everything, into one of being sort of drowned by trash. And I don't know, I don't really have anything particularly smart to say about these two sort of poles, but I wonder, there's a lot in here about the anxiety of a sort of over fullness, and I'm wondering about the sort of like counterpart anxiety of like emptiness and loss.
Yeah, no, I mean, you just said it. You just said it. And I think this is precisely that shift from the kind of absolute erasure of the atomic light, right, to the overfullness of this plastic ocean. And that, even if scientists are making, microorganisms that can digest plastic, as Jennifer mentioned, there's always going to be waste. At some point the planet, it'll be like the Little Prince's planet, where if he's not weeding every day, it just is going to get too full and go lopsided. And that's what we're coming to. I think you've absolutely named the shift we've made. So thank you all. That was tons of fun for me. So.